Well, good morning, Salem. Glad to see you all here this morning. Happy New Year. As we turn into a new year, I find that this particular time of year is always a great time to do a little bit of reflecting. I know that when I find some quiet moments, which sometimes are a little bit hard to come by during the Christmas season, I find myself maybe sitting early in the morning with a cup of coffee and just reflecting on the year that's been. I think one of the great things about doing that is it's a reminder to us that every time we look back, I don't care what year you've gone through, there are some valleys and there's some mountaintops. And the thing that I'm always able to see through all of that, oftentimes I remember the valleys more than I remember other things, but what I'm reminded of is the fact that God saw me through each one of those. And so then as I enter into a new year, it gives me great confidence as a follower of Jesus that his faithfulness for all the years that have been before remind us that he'll be faithful in the year that is. And so my prayer for each one of you is that you're greatly anticipating whatever it is that God has in store for you in 2024. And no matter what mountaintops you experience and whatever valleys you find yourself having to trudge through, may you always be reminded that he is faithful and he promises never to leave you alone. We're talking about a sermon series that's going to go for the next 6 weeks. It's called It's About Time. And so my guess is you can think about all kinds of different things when it comes to time. I was joking with the 9 o'clock service. Had a couple people raise their hands because I asked them if they thought that they were going to be late for church, only to find out that they were 25 minutes early. And there's probably going to be a couple of people that are going to walk in here in the next 5 to 10 minutes, and so I've asked our camera people to capture them and shame them when they walk in at 11 o'clock. No, we won't do that for a second. But it's just a reminder to us that time is just a part of our lives. But before we get into that, I want to do a little play on words because I think it's about time. You know what it's about time for? It's about time for the Detroit Lions to win the NFC North Division. Yes, sir, it's about stinking time. This is how long it's been since the Detroit Lions have won the NFC North. For those of you that might be new here and starting something new and you're going, why in the world is Tim talking about the Detroit Lions? I'm from Michigan. I'm a lifelong Lions fan, so you can feel bad for me. Okay, so here's the deal. I was 22 years old the last time we won a division championship. 22 years old. It's 30 years ago. I haven't even been married 30 years. This is how bad it is. My wife, who is a lifelong Green Bay Packers fan, and my in-laws who are in the room right now, I've lived my entire life with this family and never won a division championship. So there, we won. Okay. Now here's the problem. We'll probably wind up playing the Packers in the first round of the playoff and lose in Detroit, but whatever. That's just the Detroit Lions fan in me. Okay, enough. This is not what this is about, but it's about stinking time. Okay. Time. What I realize is that there's this side of us in life that can't get away from time. We just finished talking about people that showed up at 8:30, people that showed up at 9, people that showed up at 10:30, show up at 11. I mean, we're just driven by time. We can't get away from it. We live in a finite world, not an infinite world. I think one of the greatest things about heaven is I'm hoping that once we get there that it isn't so driven by a clock. We have to get a certain amount of sleep here. We have to think through when the next activity is. We got to make sure that we're there when it starts on time. We got to get to work on time. We got to get to the show on time. We got to get to school on time. We got to get to the thing. We got to do the... it's exhausting. And then there's traffic. It messes everything up. And then you're stressed because you're going to be not on time. And then you've got grandparents that tell you you're not on time unless you're 15 minutes early. And then there's those that think they're on time if they're on time. And then there's people who think they're on time if they're within, ish. So what do you do with that? Well, we live in time. But what I want you to understand is we talk about this series for the next 6 weeks. This isn't so much about minutes and hours and days. I would suggest it's much more about this. I used a winter landscape just because we're in the middle of January. I know this doesn't look anything like Texas, but I thought it was pretty. Here's the thing. What we're going to be talking about for the next several weeks is this idea that we walk through seasons in life. And so I want you to get your head wrapped around that the author of the book of Ecclesiastes wrestles through what that looks like and talks about different seasons in our life, and some seasons are short, some seasons are long, some are hard, some are easy. We're going to wrestle through 14 of them. And I think it's going to be a great opportunity for us to stretch ourselves. So we're going to talk through this book of Ecclesiastes. What's interesting is some people believe that King Salem is the author of Ecclesiastes, and there's a really high probability that he is. And so we're going to just assume that he is at this point, but for those that are going to fact check me because you love doing that, Just know that I recognize that it may be King Solomon, it may not. And where they get that from is when Ecclesiastes opens up, it talks about the son of King David being a leader in Jerusalem, all those kinds of things. Talks about wisdom. It's clearly a guy who's toward the fourth quarter of his life, and he's looking back, and it's a guy that has accomplished a great deal, has accumulated a great deal, has everything that this world could offer, and yet he gets to the very end of his life, and he's looking back, and here's what he concludes, that life is meaningless. And so you're thinking to yourself, well, thanks, Tim. New year, new day, and that's what you come up with. Life is meaningless. Well, welcome to 2024, everybody. That's what I got for you. Okay, it's going to get better, I promise. But here's the point. The author of Ecclesiastes is kind of wrestling through this whole deal, and he gets to the end of his life. He's looking back. He's accumulated all this stuff, accomplished more than anybody else. For all intents and purposes, he ought to be the guy that's going, yes, I win, right? And instead, he gets to the end of his life, and he's looking back, and he's kind of saying, well, it's meaningless. I've accumulated all this stuff, and you know what's going to happen? I'm going to die, and I'm going to give it to somebody else. I've done all these different things, and somehow I still feel not totally satisfied. I've accomplished all these things. I got all these awards, all these trophies, all this different stuff, and at the end of the day, somehow it doesn't satisfy my soul. So he finally gets to a spot where he says, so here's what I've determined. What's best for humanity is to eat, drink, and find value in your work. So that's it. That's what life's about. Eat, drink, find some value or some joy in your work. Otherwise, it's all meaningless. I take you to Matthew chapter 22, and it's interesting. Jesus was being put on the spot by some folks. And what's happening is he's just come through the triumphal entry, and he's with some folks, and they're kind of pressing him, and they're saying, so Jesus, which one's the greatest commandment? And you can imagine that in that moment, they're always trying to trap him, right? And they're trying to get him to sort of somehow rank the different commandments that came out when the Israelites came out of the Exodus moment, went through the Red Sea, they get to Sinai, and Moses is given the 10 Commandments. So rank them, Jesus, which one's the greatest? And Jesus, who's absolutely going to refuse to be trapped, but still answers the question, because what he's always doing is getting to the question behind the question. And what he's getting at is the same thing that the author of Ecclesiastes is dealing with, because what the author of Ecclesiastes determined is that life is meaningless if it's all about me. And the greater challenge is that we live in a world and a culture that says, that's right. It's about you. It's about me. It's about your joy, it's about your pleasure, it's about all the stuff that you accumulate, it's about all of that. And this guy gets all the way to the end of his life and says it's meaningless if not for this. And so then Jesus is trying to answer this question. So what's the greatest commandment? So Tim, where are you going with this? Well, let me show you the answer that Jesus gives, because he refuses to be trapped, but he says that this is what makes life not meaningless. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. 1, love the Lord your God. You notice it doesn't say love yourself. It doesn't say it's all about you. It says put your focus on me. Be reminded of the fact that you are created, that there's a God and you're not him. Be reminded of the fact that there's one who put a plan into place that Paul just talked about with this whole idea of God's faithfulness. And that no matter how many times we've tried to torpedo the plan or go with our own plan, God continues to be faithful, continues to do the plan, and we know where that plan went. We just celebrated a baby in Bethlehem, but we also know the plan didn't stop there. If it stopped there, we'd still be people without hope. It would just be some other baby that we celebrate. But it's not, because we know that that baby grew, lived a life we couldn't, died on a cross, walked out of a tomb, ascended into heaven, sits on the right hand of God the Father until one day we'll spend eternity with him. So love that God, the only God, your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then he says, number 2, I want you to love your neighbors yourself. Jesus' whole point in this is to say life would be meaningless if you make it about you. I've heard over the years this phrase that says you were created on purpose for a purpose. Let me say that again. You were created on purpose for a purpose. But the purpose wasn't your own, whatever you're trying to accomplish. But we're always trying to make a name for ourselves. We always want to be remembered. We always want it to be about us. We always want to experience, have, accumulate, whatever the case may be. And what God's trying to say is it was never about you in the first place. And when we keep our focus on loving God and loving others, suddenly life has purpose and meaning. And that's where Ecclesiastes goes, and so that's the totality of the book. But what I want us to do now for the next 6 weeks is lean into Ecclesiastes chapter 3. For those of you that want to be able to do a little bit of homework, because some of you like to read ahead and do different kinds of stuff, I want to encourage you to go back and read Ecclesiastes 1 and 2. Kind of sets up the whole premise of the book, and then finally gets to Ecclesiastes 3. And Jason and I, for the next 6 weeks, are going to look at the first 8 verses. And it looks at these different parts of life, these different seasons that we walk through. And I was going to try to sum it up, but I read this and thought, I don't know that I can do any better than this. I remind you that we're pretty sure that it's King Solomon, so understand that. So King Solomon introduces a series of 14 opposing seasons and events in the cycle of life. All the moments in Solomon's list combine to represent the whole of human activity in its varied expressions. Our lives in this world are a blend of joy and sorrow, ups and downs, harmony and discord, rooting and upheaval. And Solomon acknowledges that every moment has its proper place and time appointed by God. From beginning to end, the Lord is in control. I love this word. He's sovereign, and he has a purpose. We just talked about that. Created on purpose for a purpose. And he has a purpose in every season, whether we understand it or not. I think this word is connected to this issue. If we trust that God is God, and that he's in control, and that he's sovereign, it means that whether anything in this world makes sense, it's immaterial. It's not the point. The point is, if we start by loving God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and worry about loving others, the rest of it starts to fall into place. And here's the thing. When God's in control, there's something nice sometimes about going, not my thing. We live in a world that wants to be able to take control, but I think the longer we live, as you understand, if you want to read the rest of Ecclesiastes and get the wisdom from this author, most likely Solomon, right, is to recognize that when we try to be in control, we recognize the longer we live life that we're not. And the joy of finally putting it in his hands. Ecclesiastes 3:1 says, there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. This particular word just sticks out to me. I don't know where your mind goes when you see something like that, but I can tell you where my mind goes. I find myself in a spot where I think to myself, look, we're in church and we're reading the Bible, and really? Everything? Like, is everything got a time when it's okay, in bounds, doable? I think we got to be a little bit careful where we go with some of this stuff, right? Because there's some things that are just flat wrong. I don't care what time you do them. They're just wrong. But what Ecclesiastes is getting at is this recognition that in many ways as followers of Jesus, because what we do isn't what earns us eternal life, but rather what Christ did on the cross in the empty tomb, we remember that it's not what we do that saves us, it's what's already been done. So our doing comes out of our being in that loving Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. So time for everything. The Apostle Paul suggests that everything may be permissible, but not everything is valuable. And I think as Christ followers, it's important for us to use some discernment in the way in which we operate so that we don't cause other people to stumble in our freedom as Christ followers. So time for everything. I sometimes think that this is the way we live our lives as Christ followers. We kind of see God as some sort of genie that somehow if we do everything right, whether it's rub the bottle with our prayer life, or I tend to be a pretty linear guy, and so I find myself frustrated at moments when God doesn't operate in linear fashion. I mean, A plus B is supposed to equal C. And every once in a while in my life, it does seem to equal C, but sometimes it equals H, and sometimes it's Y, and sometimes I don't even understand the formula. And I'm quite certain that God's looking at me just trying to say, Tim, there isn't a formula. Last time I checked, I'm God and you're not him. And so in that, we start to live our lives trying to see if I do everything the right way, something should turn out a certain way in the end, but we recognize that's not the way life works. And then our prayer life becomes a little bit of a genie in the bottle where we ask God for everything that we want, and then we get frustrated when he doesn't answer in our timing or in our way or whatever the case may be. And what God keeps trying to help us understand is that he's the one who's sovereign, and we continue to live life, and we've got these tensions that we live in, and that's where Ecclesiastes 3 starts to go. So Ecclesiastes 3:2 says there's a time to be born and a time to die. What's interesting is I think we often live here. Most tombstones look a little like this. There's a dash here. Mine's going to have this, 1971, and it's going to be 2000 something. We look forward to this moment, don't we? Obvious truth, every person in this room was born. But here's the other truth. Every one of us in this room is also going to die. I found myself in an interesting spot last weekend. If you happen to have been here, last Sunday of the year, we always celebrate those who we've walked with in the previous year who got us called home. Those whose memorial and funeral services we've done. And so last week I had a baptismal font on the altar, and I was baptizing the infant of a couple that I married off a couple of years ago, and on either side of the baptismal font was these crystal crosses that represented everyone who had died in the past year. And so here I am juxtaposed right between these crosses with this reminder of baptism, which represents new life. And on top of that, a baby. And so right between those is this reminder that that's what this life is. We're all born, but we're all born and we're all going to ultimately die, and we're ultimately going to stand in this position one day. And on that day, there's the judgment. I had the privilege this last week of being made aware that one of our families who lost a loved one in the last year was going to be in our cemetery, and so I just made a point to drive over and found the family standing there and got the privilege of just being able to stand there and laugh a little, cry a little, have a prayer together, and be reminded that even as we were standing in a cemetery, being reminded of the mortality that we have, that it's not the end of the story. So it's time to be born. It's time to die. The psalmist says this. He says, our days may come to 70 years or 80 if strength endures, yet the best of them are but trouble, sorrow. It's interesting, obviously, when the psalmist was writing this, probably the life expectancy was clearly 70 to 80 years. Not a whole lot has changed, has it? What's interesting is the longer that I walk life with people and get the privilege of being able to have some really tender conversations with folks, I find that those that make it to their 90s and are starting to push 100, you want to know one of the phrases that they often say to me? Hey, Tim, I'm ready to go see Jesus. There's something that longs and groans and hopes for a life beyond this. Even a few conversations that I've already had this morning with folks as they were walking in, and it's a little bit colder and the bones and the joints and things aren't operating the same way that they used to. Just this reminder that we don't grow younger, we grow older. And we're all eventually going to die. And I think the part that could feel really discouraging is this, right? So great, Tim, so this is what I'm destined for, a life of trouble and sorrow that quickly passes and then we die. Well, I wish I could tell you that life was just going to be a cupcake, easy. But what we recognize is we live in a sinful and a fallen world, and that doesn't mean that life is all going to be terrible. I'm not up here this morning trying to say, well, welcome to 2024. It's meaningless and sorrow and trouble. But I am saying that there's some reality to the fact that we live in a sinful and a fallen world, and if it weren't but for the grace of God, we would live as hopeless people. What Ecclesiastes is reminding of us of the today is that each one of us were born. Each one of us is going to die. And here's what Hebrews says. People are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment. Man, that could be scary, couldn't it? I know that there were years for me that I was always fearful of this judgment moment. And I find the longer that I live in the grace of God, I remind myself of that this is nothing to be afraid of. Why? Because when the judge sees me, he's going to say not guilty. And I might think to myself, well, how is that possible when I already know what I've done or what I haven't done? And I know what the verdict ought to be, and the verdict ought to be guilty. But here's the deal. Because that baby was born in Bethlehem, and because he lived the life that I couldn't, and because he took the penalty that I deserved, he stood in front of the judge. He took the penalty guilty, and because of that, I get the verdict not guilty, and so do you. So as Christ followers, we don't fear the judgment. We don't. Yes, we're born and are ultimately going to die, but we don't fear death because death isn't something to be feared, because we don't fear the judgment. The verdict's in, you're not guilty. Teach us to number our days. Here's the interesting thing, our days are numbered. So teach us to do the opposite. Why? So that we can gain a heart of wisdom. Our days are numbered, so the psalmist says to teach us to number our days, which means live your life in such a way that you recognize that you were born and are ultimately going to die. You were created on purpose for a purpose, and never forget that. What we learn from the author of Ecclesiastes is this heart of wisdom, this reminder to us that our life is here, it's short. So what we do with it matters when we live on purpose. And so when we love God and love people, it puts things in order. Ecclesiastes 3 goes on to say there's a time to plant and a time to uproot. What's interesting is, on the one hand, it's certainly talking about planting a garden. I chose to use a tomato plant, so you plant the tomato, but at the end of the year, you got to uproot the tomato. Tomato has a lifespan, and then it's done. You got to till up the soil and get it ready for next year. And the reminder to us in our lives, and I think we struggle with this as people, I think we struggle with it in the church. I think it's just hard. We don't like change. And yet it's this reminder to us of the fact that everything that has a beginning also has an end. We don't like ends. Ends for us in many cases are sad. Even if it's some happy fairy tale ending, most of us look at that and go, it's a fairy tale. And so it's this reminder to us of that things begin, things end. And so we find great joy in the beginnings and we find some angst in the endings. But maybe the challenge for you in 2024 is to figure out what are the things that you need to start and what are the things that you probably need to end. And we got to keep asking that in the church as well. It's hard. I've got a book on my shelf that's called Necessary Endings. I've now read that book probably 2 or 3 times, depending upon the season of life that I'm walking through. It's a constant reminder to us and to me that there's things that begin in my life and there's things that have to come to an end. We continue to walk that journey, a time to plant, time to uproot. And Jesus said this as he was coming to the end of his ministry. He said, very truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. I love Jesus' words here because in this moment he's about to die. He's in the last week of his life, and in essence he's suggesting that I'm going to have to lay down my life so that many may live. But for us as Christ followers, it's the reminder that we're also called to lay down our lives so that others might live. And so what's God calling you to in 2024 as you do that? And then Jesus goes on to say, anyone who loves their life will lose it. I've heard this phrase more recently than I have in quite some time. If you don't know what FOMO is, you're probably my generation or older. But FOMO is the acronym for fear of missing out. I think we tend to live our lives that way, right? We're fearful that we're going to lose. That somehow there's something in life that we're going to miss out on. And so you see the focus starts to be on us and all the different stuff that we want to be able to accomplish or do or accumulate or whatever the case may be. And what Jesus is reminding us of is this: love me, love others. Because if you try to hang on to your own life, you're going to lose it. And the very thing that you're afraid of missing out on is far bigger than you realize. Because anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Time to be born. Time to die. We all face the judgment, the verdict's not guilty. A time to begin things, a time to end things. And in the process, God does his work. So my prayer for each one of you as we begin this year is that we see God's faithfulness behind us and live in the great confidence that he walks with us in the year that's ahead. Would you bow your head and pray with me? Father God, we thank and praise you for the privilege of being able to gather together in your house. It's a constant reminder to us when we come in here that you are God and you are sovereign and you are in control. And we confess again those times in our lives where we try to take over control or get frustrated that you don't operate the way we think you ought to or in the time frame we deem necessary. And so God, this morning we're reminded of the fact that there's some truth, absolute truth in the fact that each one of us was born, and the minute we were born there was a numbering of our days. So God, teach us to number our days. And God, we also recognize that in our lives there are beginnings, and with every beginning there's an end. Maybe there's things in our lives that we've been hanging on to that we need to let go of and let end. God, maybe it's a grudge. Maybe it's something else. But God, we ask that you would make that clear to us. Where do we need a fresh start? And where do we need to end? Most of all, God, may we be reminded of your sovereignty and your love and your grace for us that's new every morning. So as we begin this new year, we remind ourselves again of your faithfulness and hang on to you with all that we've got. These things we ask in your precious and holy name.